Did you know that simple decisions, small actions in a fleeting moment, can change a person's life forever? Join me in a story filled with unexpected twists and turns, and a reflection on the boundaries of relationships that we all think we understand. Is the pursuit of love and recognition worth losing yourself in the process? Come explore with me now. Everything in my life had become routine. 10 years of marriage had gradually blended into a sequence of motions that I performed. Day after day, I took care of the house, the children, and all the responsibilities that came with family life. But somewhere along the way, I became invisible. My husband, often away for work, was emotionally absent, even when he was home. There was no fighting, no screaming, just a silence that grew louder each day. It wasn't a conflict, but a distance that couldn't be bridged. I began to feel more like a roommate than a wife. I cooked, cleaned, and took care of everything, but there was no real connection anymore. The love had faded, replaced by a quiet, growing void. The house felt cold, and I felt like a shadow in my own life. It was during these long, silent days that Nick moved in across the street. He wasn't the charming, attention-seeking neighbor. In fact, he was quiet, a little reserved, but he had this calm presence that drew me in. I first noticed him when he helped the neighbors with their car repairs or shoveled snow from driveways. He had an easy, dependable energy. He didn't demand attention, but he gave it when it was needed. He was always present in a way I hadn't experienced in years. At first, I didn't think much of him. He was just the neighbor, quiet, polite, never making waves. But there was something different about him. It wasn't about attraction at first. It was how he made eye contact, how he listened when people spoke, how he remembered small details. There was a kindness in him that felt so rare. He saw people for who they were, and somehow, in those brief exchanges, I realized something. He saw me. I hadn't been seen in a long time, not truly seen. It wasn't even something I noticed right away. But before we go any further, if stories like these make you think, feel, or reflect, even if they make you uncomfortable, please take a second to subscribe to Stories I Know. Now let's continue. The first time he asked about my day, I thought, nothing of it. But it lingered. I realized he actually cared. For the first time in years, someone was paying attention to me, and it wasn't just a passing glance. It was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had been suffocating for too long. It started small. He'd wave when we saw each other, stop for a brief chat about the kids, the weather, or the things we both noticed in the neighborhood. His voice, calm and steady, grounded me in a way I hadn't felt in so long. But I didn't expect it to go further. After all, he was just a neighbor. He wasn't supposed to matter in the grand scheme of things. But with every small talk, every fleeting smile, I started to feel something shift inside me. It wasn't a romantic feeling at first. It was the feeling of being noticed, of being cared about. I hadn't realized how much I needed that until Nick offered it, so effortlessly. Each time he came over, whether to help with a broken light or to fix something small, I felt a little more alive. His presence wasn't just a distraction from the loneliness. It was a subtle affirmation that I was worth paying attention to. One afternoon, when the sink started leaking again, I found myself texting Nick. I could have fixed it myself, but I didn't want to. I wanted to see him again. I didn't even question it. My fingers just typed the message, and before I knew it, he was standing on my doorstep, a friendly smile on his face. I remember the moment so clearly, standing in my kitchen, watching him crouch down to fix the pipe. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. The kitchen was warm, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. He wasn't in a rush, taking his time as he worked, and I found myself watching him, hanging on every word, every movement. It felt so natural, so easy. For the first time in months, I laughed, really laughed, at something he said about his ex-wife's obsession with Pinterest plumbing hacks. It was silly, but it felt good. Nick looked up at me and said, "That laugh, you should do that more often." And that was it. That one comment, those words. That was when everything shifted. No one had said something like that to me in so long. Not my husband. Not anyone. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a reminder that I existed. I froze for a moment. There was something in his words, something that resonated deeply with me. How long had it been since someone really saw me, truly looked at me, and acknowledged my presence? It had been years. As he finished fixing the pipe, he stayed a little longer, sipping coffee, talking about everything and nothing. We spoke easily, and when it was time for him to leave, he gave me that warm, knowing smile. "Anytime you need a hand," he said, "just holler." He walked out the door, and I stood there, in the silence of my kitchen, feeling the weight of his words lingering in the air. It wasn't just about the sink. It was about everything that had been left unsaid in my life. I couldn't put it into words, but in that moment, something deep inside me had woken up. It was terrifying, because I didn't know where this would lead. But it also felt like a relief, like a release. I couldn't stop thinking about him. The next morning, when I checked my phone, his text was still there, reminding me that he'd fixed the sink. His words, his presence, his attention, they all kept circling in my mind, pulling me back. Every time my phone buzzed with his name, my heart raced a little faster. I didn't want to admit it, but I was looking forward to hearing from him. I needed it. What began as a simple request for help with a leaking pipe had opened a door I couldn't close again. Something inside me was stirring, and I didn't know how to stop it. The boundary between friendship and something more was becoming blurred, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something I had needed for a long time. A part of me knew it was dangerous, but another part of me just wanted to feel seen again, wanted to feel alive. And now that I had tasted it, I wasn't sure I could walk away. In that moment, I was both terrified and relieved. I had crossed a line I never thought I would cross, and though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew this: I was no longer invisible. Nick's presence in my life grew slowly, like the gradual turning of a page in a book I had stopped reading years ago. At first, it was nothing more than polite small talk when we'd run into each other, a wave here, a friendly hello there. But then the conversations began to stretch, to linger a little longer. He would ask about the kids, about how I was really doing, not just the routine, how's everything at home, but something deeper, something more genuine. It was strange at first to be asked those questions. I had almost forgotten what it felt like for someone to care enough to ask, let alone listen to the answer. The silence that had weighed so heavily on me for so long began to feel a little lighter when Nick was around. It wasn't just the practical things he'd come over to help with, changing light bulbs, fixing the gate, or patching up the roof, but The way he was always present, his attention steady and unwavering. Each time he came over, each time he lingered just a little longer, I felt a small but unmistakable shift inside me. A warmth I hadn't felt in years. Something simple, like him noticing the way my kitchen window fogged up in the rain, or laughing at my stories about the kids, was all it took to remind me that I wasn't invisible. The emptiness I had carried with me for so long started to be filled, piece by piece. His attentiveness, his memory of small details about my life were like tiny stitches mending a fabric I hadn't realized was torn. He remembered that I liked my coffee black and strong, that my daughter was terrified of thunderstorms, that I had always wanted to take a trip to the mountains. These were things I hadn't even thought about in years, things my husband had never noticed. Nick made me feel like I mattered again, like I wasn't just a wife, a mother, a person with no identity beyond those roles. There was a part of me, a small voice in the back of my mind, that told me to stop, to pull away before things went too far. But with every passing conversation, every shared laugh, I felt a dangerous pull, a temptation that wasn't necessarily romantic at first, but something deeper, something more insistent. It was a longing, a need to be seen for who I was, not just for what I could do. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I had buried inside me. All the feelings I had suppressed, all the little pieces of myself I had forgotten about in my marriage, began to resurface. I didn't even want to acknowledge it at first. I told myself it was just friendship, just someone to talk to. But I knew that was a lie. It wasn't just about the conversations. It was about the way I felt when he looked at me, when he listened to me in a way that no one else had in years. I found myself thinking about him when he wasn't around, wondering when he might come by next, when I might get another moment of attention, however fleeting. And then, when he knocked on the door again, this time to fix a leaky sink, I realized something that scared me more than I was willing to admit. I wasn't just looking forward to seeing him because of the sink. I was looking forward to the way he made me feel. Seen, heard, important. The sound of the water running in the sink, the quiet hum of the house, all faded into the background as Nick crouched down, inspecting the pipe. I stood by, trying to act casual, but inside, I was trembling, not from nervousness, but from anticipation. There was something different this time. His words, his presence, they filled a void inside me that had been empty for so long. He smiled at me, a warm, knowing smile, and I felt my heart stir in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't even know how to explain it, but it was like a spark had ignited in me, something that had been dormant for far too long. When he finished, he didn't leave immediately. We stood there, sipping coffee, exchanging stories that had nothing to do with the sink. He remembered the smallest things about my life, things my husband had forgotten or never cared to ask about. He looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that no one had in so long, and I felt something inside me shift again. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to stop it. I realized that in those small moments with Nick, I had started to feel alive again. The woman I had buried beneath layers of duty, obligation, and routine was slowly starting to emerge. It terrified me because I knew it wasn't just about fixing pipes or exchanging pleasantries anymore. It was about something I hadn't felt in a long time: connection. And I didn't know how to navigate this new feeling, this dangerous pull that was pushing me to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. For the first time in years, I had a glimpse of what it felt like to be more than just a caretaker, more than just someone who existed in the background. Nick's attention made me feel visible again, and that feeling, as simple as it seemed, was enough to awaken desires I had long since buried. But as the days passed, I began to wonder, was this truly harmless? Was I allowed to feel this way? Or had I crossed a line that would change everything? I didn't know the answer, but I couldn't stop myself from asking the questions. And with every passing day, those questions grew louder, echoing through the silence of my home. The silence between my husband and me. The days with Nick grew longer, and with every passing conversation, the space between us seemed to shrink. It was never supposed to go this far. I hadn't planned any of this, but somewhere along the way, the boundary between simple conversation and something more began to blur. Nick didn't just listen to me. He saw me. He remembered things that mattered. He asked how I was feeling, not in the way my husband asked, but with a genuine curiosity, an interest that came from somewhere deeper. For the first time in years, someone was making me feel like I existed beyond the walls of my home, beyond the roles of wife and mother. I had always thought that loyalty was the bedrock of a marriage, that the emotional connection I longed for could only be nurtured within those vows. But what if those vows had become empty promises, hollow echoes in a house where silence spoke louder than words? What if the neglect, the distance, had built walls too thick to break down? And what if, without realizing it, I had started looking for the very thing I had lost, feeling alive, in someone else? One evening, Nick stayed later than usual. We were sitting on the couch, the dim light from the lamp casting soft shadows across the room. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, and outside, the wind rustled through the trees, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He had been talking about something trivial, his old dog, his love for hiking, but it was the way he looked at me that made my heart race. It wasn't the gaze of a neighbor, or even of a friend. There was something more in his eyes, something that mirrored the stirrings inside me. For a moment, everything paused. Time slowed. The room felt heavy with the quiet tension that had been building between us. I could feel the weight of my own breath, the quiet ache in my chest that had been growing for so long. And before I could stop it, before I could pull away, before I could remind myself of the promises I had made to my husband, Nick leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, slow, almost hesitant, as if he too was unsure of what was happening. It wasn't passion. It wasn't wild or urgent. It was a kiss that spoke of something deeper, a quiet intimacy, a yearning to be seen, to be valued, to feel wanted. It was the kind of kiss that catches you off guard, that stirs emotions you thought you had buried long ago. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I wasn't just a wife, a mother, a caretaker. I was someone worthy of being noticed, worthy of being touched, of being wanted. But as soon as it happened, I knew. I knew the weight of what I had just done. The kiss wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was a betrayal. It was a betrayal of my marriage, my vows, my commitment. The guilt washed over me immediately, sharp and cold, like a bucket of ice water poured over my head. My heart hammered in my chest. And yet beneath the guilt, there was something else. Something I couldn't explain. A strange, unsettling sense of peace. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, still feeling the warmth of his touch on my skin. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the floor. But it couldn't clear the fog in my mind. I sat up slowly, rubbing my temples, the quiet of the house pressing in on me. I felt as if the world had shifted overnight. My husband was still asleep upstairs, completely unaware of what had transpired, and the thought of facing him made me sick. I couldn't even look at him without seeing Nick's eyes, without remembering that kiss. I went through the motions, making coffee, getting dressed, trying to breathe. But there was an ache in my chest, a hollow feeling that wouldn't go away. I tried to push it down, to convince myself that it didn't matter, that I was just confused, that it was a mistake. But I knew deep down that it wasn't just a mistake. What happened between Nick and me wasn't just about a kiss. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something I couldn't ignore anymore. The emotional neglect, the loneliness, the constant feeling of being unseen. That was what I had betrayed. I wasn't just a wife who cheated. I was a woman who had been starving for connection, for attention, for validation, and I had let it lead me to a place I never thought I would go. And in that moment, I realized just how much of myself I had given up over the years, how much of me I had lost to the empty routine of marriage. The kiss, as simple and soft as it had been, was a culmination of everything I had buried inside me. It wasn't about Nick. It was about me. About the parts of myself I had ignored, the needs I had shoved aside, the person I had become, someone who wasn't even sure who she was anymore. Now, I was left with the aftermath, the weight of my actions, the guilt of what I had done, and, yet underneath it all, a strange, uncomfortable peace. Because for the first time in years, I felt needed. I felt seen. But it came at a cost. And the question that haunted me wasn't just whether I had betrayed my husband. It was whether, in some way, I had betrayed myself. The days after that night with Nick were a blur of confusion and regret. I couldn't look at him, not without feeling the weight of what had happened, not without seeing his face in every corner of my mind. Every time I walked by his house, I would keep my eyes firmly forward, not daring to acknowledge the undeniable connection that had sparked between us. My heart would beat faster, not with anticipation, but with fear. Fear of facing what I had allowed to happen. Fear of confronting the emptiness that had drawn me to him in the first place. At home, things were no better. My husband went about his day, unaware of the secret that now clung to my skin like an unwanted stain. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the laundry, on the groceries, on the endless chores that filled the house. But in the silence between us, I could feel the divide growing. The distance between us had always been there, but now it felt like an unbearable chasm. Every touch from him felt hollow, a reminder of everything that was missing. I began to lie to him, not just with my words, but with my actions. I deleted every message from Nick, every trace of the contact we had shared. I erased everything that reminded me of that moment of vulnerability, of that kiss. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, the guilt gnawed at me. It was a hunger, a constant reminder of what I had done. I could still feel Nick's hand on my cheek, the warmth of his fingers, the slight hesitation before he touched me. I replayed the moments over and over in my head, the way he had looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, the way he listened to me, truly listened, in a way that no one else ever had. I had been starved for that attention for so long, for that simple acknowledgement of my existence. It had crept in so slowly, so quietly, that I didn't even realize I had been desperate for it. Now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed something sacred. My vows, my marriage, everything I had once held dear. The man I had committed my life to. Was I betraying him by simply needing more? By searching for a connection, a spark of life that had long been extinguished between us? But then there was the other side of the coin. Maybe I wasn't a terrible person. Maybe I was just a lonely wife, someone who had been living in the coldness of neglect for far too long. Maybe I had reached out, not out of malice, but because I didn't know how to fill the emptiness anymore. Maybe Nick wasn't the problem. Maybe it was the emptiness in my own heart that had led me to him. I couldn't find an answer that made sense. Each thought seemed to contradict the next. Was I searching for warmth? Or was I betraying something sacred? Both answers felt true, and yet neither of them offered me any comfort. There were nights when I lay awake beside my husband, the weight of the guilt pressing down on my chest. I listened to him breathe softly in his sleep, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I wondered if he could feel the shift, the quiet shift that had happened between us. Was it just me? Or had something inside our marriage broken beyond repair? I tried harder. I tried to be the wife I once was. I cooked his favorite meals, put on the perfume I knew he liked, and laughed at his jokes. I reached out to him in ways I hadn't in years, touched his hand as we passed in the hallway, held him a little longer when he hugged me. But the connection was still missing. The warmth was still absent. I realized that no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough to fix what had been broken for so long. And still, I couldn't stop thinking about Nick. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a pang of longing in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just seeking validation. But I knew deep down that it was more than that. I was searching for something I hadn't had in my marriage for so long. Attention. Real, genuine attention. The guilt was a constant companion. And yet, when I thought about the moments I had shared with Nick, there was something else. A quiet peace. Not because I was happy with what I had done, but because for the first time in so long, I had been seen. I had been heard. I had mattered to someone. And that feeling, no matter how fleeting, was like a drug I couldn't quit. But the question still haunted me. Was it worth it? Was the fleeting moment of being seen worth the destruction I had caused? Could I ever go back to the way things were, or had I crossed a line that couldn't be undone? The guilt churned inside me, but it wasn't the only feeling I was left with. There was a longing, an ache for something more than what I had. And that, more than anything, made me question everything about my life, my marriage, and the choices I had made. I couldn't erase what had happened, and I couldn't take back the kiss. It was done. But what I couldn't figure out was whether I had truly betrayed my marriage, or if I was simply a woman who had been trying to find her way out of an emotional desert. Would I ever forgive myself? Could my marriage ever survive the truth? Every time I saw my husband, I wondered if he knew. Every time I looked at Nick, I felt the weight of what we had shared. The emotional neglect that had shaped me, that had pushed me into his arms, was something I couldn't ignore anymore. But as much as I wanted to blame my marriage for the choices I had made, I knew that in the end, I was the one who had crossed the line. I was the one who had taken a step too far, and now I had to live with the consequences. The guilt, the regret, the loneliness. It was all mine to carry now. If you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories I Know. Your support helps us bring more stories to the forefront. Stories that might make us rethink our own lives, relationships, and the choices we make. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.